Welcome to the Gonzaga Socratic Club. I am glad you're here this afternoon. It looks like we're getting a semi-spring, but here you are. We're here for some conversation about important matters. I'm glad to see you here. Thanks for coming. Gonzaga is always talking about Jesuit education. It seems like we talk about it constantly. And yet, every time we talk about it, there seems to be more to say. So we're going to add to that conversation today by looking in particular at a very personal reflection on Jesuit education. Our speaker, Dr. Debby Hutchins, came to Gonzaga in 2006, originally from Texas. She's a Texan. So she has an undergraduate degree from Sam Houston State, has studied at Texas A&M, and then had her formal introduction to Jesuit Catholic Humanist education at Boston College, where she received her PhD. Her expertise is in logic and epistemology and metaphysics. She regularly teaches symbolic logic. I don't know if any of your victims/students are here today, but the Socratic Club is inspired by the Oxford Socratic Club. You guys who are regulars here, you know this. You heard me say this before. The Oxford Socratic Club at Oxford University in the mid-1900s was an organization focused on Christian worldview issues, and it was presided over by the well-known Christian apologist C.S. Lewis. We follow the Oxford Socratic Club by taking as our motto to follow the argument wherever it leads. So we're interested in conversation, argument, and discussion, and our speaker has promised some controversial discussion today, have you not? In talking about Jesuit education. So let's proceed, and Debby Hutchins, welcome. Thanks for coming today. Yes, you're welcome.
It's nice you made up your minds. See if you want to plot at the end. I think it's the more important issue. Thank you all for coming out this afternoon. I'm always surprised and kind of delighted when I've come to the Socratic Club that so many students will come at 4 o'clock on a Friday afternoon to hear anything at all from any of us, much less to engage in philosophical discussion. I want to thank Dr. Calhoun for inviting me to speak today, and Dr. Macaron for agreeing to do it with me today. My presentation today is probably a little bit of a departure from at least many of the Socratic Club meetings that we've been to. My topic is not exactly philosophical, it's not exactly theological, and I'm really not even going to attempt to try to dress this up as having any kind of scholarly argumentation today. Those of you who know me know I like argumentation in all of its forms, logical forms anyway, but I'm not going to do that today. Instead, as Dr. Calhoun indicated to you, I'd just like to take this opportunity to share some reflections, personal reflections that I think may trigger a nice discussion. When we usually have these among faculty, it would be nice to have it among our student population a little bit more, about 4 features in Jesuit education that we spend a lot of time talking about as a faculty, and talk about them in terms of what I think has been meaningful to me with my history with the Jesuits. I like to phrase it as, sometimes I'll say, I've been with the Jesuits for 16 years now. So much so that a Jesuit from Boston College, who was my professor and spiritual advisor, and he's now a good friend, Father Tiselli, said, well, someday maybe we'll move you into St. Mary's, because he knows I really like the food at St. Mary's there. Not in the bar is unbelievable. He just wouldn't. And he said, but you can call yourself a Jesuit. So, a bit of personal history, since this is mainly a personal reflection. I am from Texas. I attended public schools in Texas, including public universities, Sam Houston State University, Houston Clear Lake, Texas A&M University, Brazos Ford College for a couple of classes. I attended nothing but public institutions of learning until the day I packed up a van and a little Geo Metro and made a beeline for the Boston area to go to Boston College. To tell you the truth, I chose to attend BC for no better reason than I had a couple of professors who were BC grads from the philosophy department, and I thought a lot of them, and they recommended it. BC offered me money, and I needed a fellowship if I was going to continue and go to school. And, well, gosh, the truth of the matter is, since I was a kid, I liked American history. I just always wanted to go to Boston, visit Boston. So I figured visit, live, grad school, it's all the same, really, when you get down to it, right? Okay, the fact that Boston College is a Jesuit school wasn't really a major part of the decision, other than, I did think it might be kind of cool to go to a Catholic school. I've gone to only public schools. I know Jesuits have a reputation for being a brainy bunch, right? Brainy priest. And it just, frankly, I think to my whole family, it sounded kind of fancy to go off to Boston College. That's not a very particularly good reason to pick a grad school. But at the heart of it, I think that's part of the reason. Well, the truth of the matter is it was a kind of poorly informed and ill-advised choice by most objective standards for me, okay? And I was warned about that in the end. I was told, no, this isn't where you want to go. This isn't a good choice. Well, a lot of reasons for that. I was a public school graduate going off to a private school, but that wasn't really the factor. This will make sense to the philosophers here and probably not so much to anyone else, okay? I was an analytically trained, coming out of an analytic program, whose specialty of the house is logic, by the way, and emanating metaphysics and epistemology all at the time, going off to a highly continental program. Well, that's not necessarily a bad thing, to get exposed to different schools of thought and shaken out of your system, but it is unusual. Plus, I had another money offer, and it was at a higher ranked school, okay? So their thoughts were, you don't turn down the higher ranked school to go to a lower ranked school so that you can visit a city you wanted to go. Okay? That seemed like a bad idea. And in fact, I would almost certainly advise any grad student, any of our students who are making that decision, not to make the decision the way I did, or the decision I did. But life is really funny. And sometimes, especially if you're a person of faith, you can see how your mistakes and your blunders and your dumb things get turned around and turn out to be just the right thing. Because I believe now, from the perspective of having gone through the program and having gone through just more years of my life, that I stumbled into being at exactly the right place at exactly the right time for what was the events that were going to transpire in my life. I have no doubt, had I gone to that other school, who I mourned and grieved for a while, the ones I didn't go to, that I would have had a great education, and I would have known nice people, and I would have gotten support, but it wouldn't have been quite the right situation. Because it turns out what I didn't know is that I was going to go through a lot of adversity and a lot of personal tragedy on my path to coming out as Dr. Hutchins. I might end up saying, I'll probably say a little bit more about that later, but I just wanted to give you a kind of setting that I have not always been quite the advocate of Jesuit education that I am now. As a matter of fact, as a student, I was probably like a lot of other students, like 100% of students that attend any school, right? I found plenty of things to grumble about what was wrong with the program and what was wrong with the school. And I once said to somebody, no, they do it this way because they are Jesuits and they've done it that way for 500 years. So I thought that after this number of years, if nothing else, I owe a debt to stand up publicly and stop saying what's wrong about the schools I went to and say what's right with Jesuit education. So I'd like to talk about 4 features of Jesuit education today that I selected because they're features that we talk about a lot, at least the faculty does in faculty discussions, and because in fact they've been meaningful and have influenced my life and my maturity both as a scholar and as a person. So, first of all, we have to do it. Let's talk about core. Okay, don't groan when I say that. I know students might tend to groan because you don't want to do it, right? Sometimes. And faculty might be inclined to groan because whether the rest of you realize it or not, we have talked and talked and talked about the core unendingly. And so, let's do some more of it. Okay? It is a good thing, and I make no bones about it. I think that the approach we take to a broad-based liberal arts education is a good one, and it's good for the student. Okay? I was actually sympathetic to this sort of education from the beginning when I arrived at a Jesuit school. Why? Sure, my undergraduate institution had a similar core. And we all know that once we graduate, while we're in school, our undergrad institution can do no right. Once we leave, they can do no wrong. Right? And they convinced me, okay, that while I might not have always wanted to take the required courses that the university thought I should, they convinced me that they did know what they were doing, largely. That these requirements served purpose, even if they didn't always entertain or delight me. Okay? They make me an educated person, a well-rounded person. Okay? My professors there convinced me that a general education, not just taking unlimited music classes, I was originally a music major, had pragmatic value. And furthermore, that I could not, at that stage of my life, really know for sure or predict what kind of knowledge or what bits of information may come in handy to me in the future, like the intro to philosophy class, perhaps. Okay. It's much the same argument that Thomas Jefferson used when he wanted to donate his library to start the Library of Congress, actually. He insisted that his gift would be accepted in its entirety or not at all. Okay? You would think, it's a strange thing to think that people would ever turn down the gift of books to me. Okay? But there was actually a lot of debate about it, I'm told, at the tour I took at the Library of Congress a couple of summers ago, and that a great deal of representatives really thought that they just wanted to accept those books that are useful to leaders, to congressmen, maybe law books or something. And what Jefferson argued is in a democratic society like ours, a society that would evolve and change over time, that we can't know what kinds of information that our leaders would need to educate themselves about in order to represent our interests and concerns. And one of the things they said at the Library of Congress is 2 of the useless topics that Jefferson had included text on that were part of that original Library of Congress were books on beekeeping and wind energy, windmills, okay? Both of which which seem a lot more maybe topical now than they would have in Jefferson's time. So maybe that proves his point. They also introduced me to a more, I guess you'd say, lofty idea about why this education was a good one. The idea of education for its own sake. Okay? I found that really, really inspiring when I was a college student. Okay? I found it inspiring and ennobling to think of education being an end in and of itself. For reasons that, to be honest, I can't fully grasp anymore why exactly I found that to be so inspirational. I don't think about it in quite the same way anymore, to tell you the truth. But what I think I did like about it is that unlike this sort of encouragement or preparation I was given growing up about why I needed to go to school, is that for the first time I had a whole group of people that said something like, education is not just for getting a better job, okay? That this is to do more for you, make money. And that's a really good idea for a music-turned-philosophy major to accept on the face of it. Because if you're doing either one of those majors because you think you're going to get rich, you're probably deluded. So I was sympathetic to the idea of a core curriculum to begin with, but I have a much richer appreciation of that, I think, now, a much different and deeper appreciation of that. And I'll talk about that today, but I want to say that to a large extent, it's not only BC, but I came from BC to here, but the conversations among members of the philosophy department, just to listen to what philosophy faculty members have to say about that. I've been honored to be the member of a department that I think takes mission and takes education, mission-driven education, very, very seriously. We don't always agree about the specifics in that, you understand, but I think we trust each other's sincerity in wanting to provide what we think is the best sort of education for students. The second feature I encountered in Jesuit education is the commitment to social justice. It makes me proud, and I bet a lot of the faculty proud, that when we hear and can tell people how much time our students devote to doing things that help others, that serve others, that make them men and women that think about others. The idea of the life of service is a great gift that I received from Jesuit education, from college education in general. There are so many people who need someone to help them, and there's so many different ways to do that. And if understood in the correct way, commitment to service can do more for our lives and go way beyond, I think, any immediate practical outcomes that we have. Okay. I was introduced to this, I think, the idea, not that my parents didn't teach me to do nice things or didn't volunteer and do charity and give to charity themselves, but they never phrased it in terms of the life of service. The first time, I remember clearly, the first time I ever heard that was when I was given a little card with Sam Houston State's motto on it. Sam Houston State is an old normal school, the first normal school west of the Mississippi. For those of you who think I'm making a comment about the abnormal schools I attended, I'm not. A normal school was a school devoted to training teachers. And the motto of Sam Houston State is, the measure of a life is its service to others. So that's something that resonated for me with Jesuit schools. Fairly late into my years at BC, I'd been there and was almost through, I was introduced to the idea, the phrase, cura personalis, the Jesuit commitment to educating the whole person. Again, this is an idea that clicked for me almost immediately. Initially, I think it was because of a much, maybe more limited version of that. I could relate it to a common reference you hear at Texas A&M, which has strong, it's an old, not a military school that has traditionally strong ties with the military. And they talk in terms of old Army days, right? In old Army days, this took place, or in old Army days, that took place. That was back when everybody was in the Corps. Okay? Well, in old Army days, what they said is that they put a lot of emphasis on what they call the other education, the education that takes place outside of the content that you actually get in coursework. And they see it really in terms of, well, I shudder to think sometimes, I don't know exactly, but it's something to do with character development. So I got that. On a more personal level, I experienced cur personalis in action at BC. Alongside, but really apart from any professional training or scholarly training I received at BC, I received a lot of attention and support. When my life fell apart there at BC, the men that I still think of as my Jesuits, which means the Jesuits in the philosophy department at BC, stepped in and ministered to me in ways ranging from the very small and practical to the profound. So, why do I think that after all the scholarly things, all the important things that are said about these features, that it's important to keep talking on every level about Jesuit mission here? Well, I'd like to preserve something about the Jesuit educational experience that I think is important. Seems like everyone agrees that the future of the order itself is uncertain. We all know the story of vocations are down. We don't have as many young Jesuits as we did. Numbers are dwindling. And according to the internet, the average age of Jesuits is 77. Now, I know they're getting up there, but that seems a little high to me. But the idea is right, even if their actual number. Even Boston College. Boston College is site of the second largest Jesuit residence in the world, St. Mary's. And in the past couple of years, they've run a lecture series that's entitled Living in the Days of the Last Jesuit. I mentioned this to a couple of them when I saw them. I said, "How do you feel like you got a target on your back or something, you know?" And their response was, "We're doing that? How'd you know?" I said, "I get the newsletter." Okay, I get the newsletter. Now, I'm not really willing to just throw up my hands about that yet, or, you know, grab a shovel to bury the Society of Jesus or anything. But there's no doubt that representation by Jesuits themselves at Jesuit institutions is declining in numbers. And there's no doubt really in anyone's mind, or as they express it, that the legacy of Jesuit education will rest largely in the hands of lay faculty. So, given that, I think as lay faculty, we have to continually ask ourselves, how are we doing? How are we doing at passing down this tradition? And for faculty at a Jesuit institution, or members of the community at a Jesuit institution, it's not just the question, are we providing a good education, but are we providing a Jesuit education? Well, like I said, our department takes that very seriously, so I've heard a lot of conversation about that. Okay. But no matter what we say about this, there's another feature that goes on. Gonzaga has to compete in the real world with a lot of other schools, very good schools for students. And our consumer culture and way of approaching things in the larger culture infiltrates and influences everything. So schools spend a lot of time branding themselves. Okay? Brand yourself as a Catholic Jesuit education, right? That's what everybody does. It's not unique. Everybody does that to stay continually competitive. But the risk there is that Jesuit could become a sort of label much like a brand name you might see on data chips or whatever, without really an investigation of what that means, okay? We have to keep turning back to the procedures, the thought, and the documents of the Society of Jesus to get a word on that, I think. So, what is distinctive? Okay, I've mentioned a few features that I think are important, but notice I was careful to tell you where I encountered those ideas first. I can compare them to similar features I found in other schools, and yes, that too is at least in part thanks to the influence of the Jesuits in American education in general. But given that I saw those similar features, that there's a reason those of us who take to it initially, I've spent a lot of time thinking, what is really distinctive? What takes place at a Jesuit institution before that doesn't at St. Houston State? What takes place in part of taking care of our students as whole individuals at a Jesuit institution that doesn't take place at another place? And I have to be honest, the answer I've come up with is absolutely nothing. I sincerely think that there's nothing even remotely distinctive about these principles if they're divorced from the religious foundation and principles which created them. They're taken out of that context and out of the historical context of the tradition. That's not to say we wouldn't have a really good school, okay, and a really good education. Just that it wouldn't be Jesuit in the sense that I think most of us intend it to be, okay? If you divorce the Jesuit education, even in its principles, we can see that Sam Houston had a core, but they don't have a core the same way with the same kind of thought. Not that we're thoughtless about it, to accomplish the same kind of principles, okay? It is at root, the Catholic tradition that animates, motivates, provides the goals and the aim and the ultimate goal that we want to shape our practices. Okay? The core doesn't just reflect what we think the student needs to be competitive in the marketplace or the world. Okay? It doesn't just aim for that sort of vague desire, I have to be well-rounded or well-educated. Okay? It's been carefully designed after a lot of careful thought. My old complaint, they've been doing it for 500 years, okay, about the human person and how to develop aspects of that, of the individual, that contribute to the flourishing of the human person. And not just because it's a good recruiting source. Jesuit education seeks to encourage the full development of the human person because that's how we can best help students achieve their divinely given gifts. We're trying to grow people here. We're trying to grow real people, men and women of conscience. One of my colleagues, and I have this feeling it actually is Dr. Macaron, I got this phrase from, but I'm not sure about that. I picked up a phrase.
If it's good, I'll take credit for it.
Meeting. That is not a phrase I'd ever heard, but I really liked. We're trying to create not just habits of mind, but habits of the heart.
I think that's Rosemary.
That's Rosemary? Okay. And that kind of stuck with me because I'd never heard that phrase before, habits of the heart. So habits of behavior as well, I would add. Okay. And not that other schools don't try to impart values and concerns, but they don't do it quite the same way for quite the same reasons. Any changes to the core we ever make have to reflect that concern, not just the desires of students or the desires of faculty, or reflect just what's new and shiny in educational trends, for another college of mine. I and everybody else loves to puff out our chest when we're in other groups of it and brag about what our students do, much, as if you owe me any credit. You don't really. But other people do this kind of work, and other students do this kind of work, but we do so much of it. But what I want to say, it's not just the quantity, I don't think, that makes it distinctly or important, If it was just a matter of degree of volunteerism, or if it were just a matter of having the right sort of political causes or social causes or doing good, then that would make us no more than a souped up Lions Club or something, right? But instead, what we have is a distinctively Jesuit commitment to social justice that is found in Christian principles. Okay? It's not just a slogan, and it can't just be a signal or a code that we rush out every now and then. I suspect strongly, as much as I know Dr. Macron's going to talk about social justice today, a little when she talks to us. So I'll leave her to that because she's really the expert here on that aspect, I have to say. Okay, that leads us to one of my favorite phrases now, plura personalis. Makes a great slogan when you're in school, the whole educating, the whole person, you know, not just part of them, not just half of them, the whole person. I've heard it so much, used so much, that I'm a little surprised at this point that somebody in university relations hasn't created a little jingle that we can put on commercials or something and sing. Since I've been here, I've heard some very serious conversations among my colleagues about how we can exemplify plura personalis. I've also heard it held up as a justification for things that you just never could have imagined or believed, from students and faculty, actually. I have heard, since I've been here, everything from a justification based on plura personalis, why I shouldn't be upset about why students in my morning class need to skip because there's a basketball game in the afternoon. And somehow I was reminded, well, don't you say plura personalis? That was this past week. No, I'm not making it up. I've heard it as an excuse for GU's somewhat infamous stances, also from a student, I might add. Because, you know, the Society of Jesus, I will tell you from all the friends I've had who are Jesuits, they totally want to encourage drunken grinding. Okay? They really see it as contributing to the flourishing of the human being. Probably not. They probably wouldn't even, well, I like to think that some of them wouldn't know what I was talking about, but who knows? Okay? I've heard it of almost anything you can imagine. Now, faculty discussions don't go that way, guys. Okay? At least not yet, I haven't heard it. Most often, what we hear from more authorized sources, I guess I should say, is something that's interpreted like we need to make students feel all warm and fuzzy. Okay? Or it's frequently said as expressing the idea that we care, Jesuit faculty, we really care about our students as people, and that's distinctive for the Jesuit. Well, what hubris? That's not true. I mean, no, it is true that we care. I didn't mean to say that. But it's not true that that's unique or distinctive. I had professors at every school I went to who genuinely took an interest in trying to help their students develop as human beings. So it's more than that. It's that, but it's more than that. Okay? So, what does it mean? You know, I said, I think it has to do, or from my understanding, this idea is it has to be aimed at developing full human potential with an aim towards formation, in other words. And by formation, I mean full moral, spiritual, intellectual development since we're a Jesuit school, in accordance with the values and religious principles taught by the Jesuits. Okay, does that mean that at Jesuit schools, we should try to make everybody a Catholic or something? No, of course, I'm not going to say that. You know that. Okay? Many of our students in faculty aren't Catholic, aren't Christian. You know. But what I want to say is they should know something about the tradition when they live here. Okay? Not only have I learned about plura personalis from faculty discussions, I learned it when I was ministered to by my Jesuits, as I told you. I had a family tragedy that I took not weeks, not months, but several years to move on from and really do well. And I would tell you, I was fed too much at St. Mary's, fed, comforted, driven places I needed to go, given lots of ice cream and whiskey. It seems to be a Jesuit thing. Okay. Counseled on Christian principles, on Catholic doctrine, on grief and how we're supposed to act. Preached to, shown really, really bad movies, nagged, spoken to kindly and sternly at times. There were even moments, there was a moment I told a friend, yeah, my personality has been current about all I can stand. So I have a sort of different view about what needs to take place. Formation, even genuine and significant transformation, doesn't always feel good. It's not always warm and fuzzy, and sometimes we have to hear things that we don't like. You do as students, and sometimes we have to say things as faculty members that we know will make you unhappy, will make you angry, will make you resentful, and will make you run and tell your friends about the torments you're being subjected to. So I guess if I use these three characteristics as my model examples, I do see one common thread through these that makes a Jesuit education distinctive, and that is education guided by and undertaken for the sake of the religious principles that gave birth to it. And by that, I mean a particular view of human nature, really. Okay? So that brings me to my fourth feature. If there are any of my logic students here, they know I'm not good at numbering, so they probably thought I said 4 and just did 3. But the fourth, the thing that truly stands out and that was truly a great gift to me from the Jesuits and from my colleagues, many of my colleagues here at Gonzaga, is Jesuit education promotes and supports both faith and reason. I teach logic, I like reason. Philosophers like reason, we like this. Now, if universities don't encourage and teach reason, I don't know who will, okay? We live in a society that's very emotionally driven, and that's encouraged because our emotions are manipulated a lot, right? They're manipulated through the media and through advertising and through people who want to sell us things, whether it's an idea or a product, okay? And allowing our emotions are good. I'm not anti-emotion. I'm not a Spock or anything, okay? But if not governed by our reason, it can be devastating. We can become prisoners to our own emotional responses. Universities, probably all of them, are aiming towards that. But in a Jesuit education, reason is supposed to exist side by side with faith, and not just as two separate things, right? They're compatible. When I was in 5th grade, Heather wanted to talk to my class about her travels in Mexico, and I remember her saying something that no matter what effect the bad effects the Spanish had had on natives in Mexico, they gave them 2 beautiful gifts, their language and their religion. Okay? And I think this idea about faith and reason being compatible and melded are the 2 beautiful gifts that my Jesuit education gave me. Okay? And by Jesuit education, I mean the education I received as a student and the education I received from you, my colleagues as well. Okay. You see, these aren't 2 distinct. The Catholic tradition tells us, and the Jesuits tell us, that these aren't just 2 separate, equal, but incompatible aspects of the human person, that they're genuinely, ultimately compatible and interrelated. We can reason about matters of faith, and being faithful is utterly reasonable. I love William James a lot. You know, my favorite essay in the whole world is The Will to Believe, when he notes that many students, when they get a certain stage along in their education, no longer think that faith is intellectually respectable. And no one who comes out of the Jesuit education and experiences it should come away with that idea, regardless of what their personal decisions are about faith. Okay? I'm not trying to take up the cross and the sword or anything. It's not my job. I'm not trying to advocate that we browbeat people who don't believe the way we do or try to convert them. I think that's wrong, and to tell you the truth, just as a good practice, Peter, I think it almost never works. Okay? But it seems to me that we also should never be embarrassed or ashamed about the religious mission of the school. So, will Jesuit schools really continue to be distinctively Jesuit as there are fewer Jesuits? I don't know. It was a come on. I got you here on false pretenses. I don't know, because I like to think the jury's still out on that one. But the thought occurs to me as I stand here, maybe the jury's always got to be out on that, to keep us active, to keep us thinking about this, always. I do have grave concerns, because it may make all of us, students and faculty, do something that we don't like to do very much. We have to surrender some of our choices to another authority, right? To the authority of the principles and the tradition. None of us like that, at least sometimes. Okay? So, does Jesuit education mean something distinctive, and will it continue to in the future? It's up to you guys. It really is up to you. Okay? You can have a good school and offer an excellent education without any of this old traditional Western Jesuit Catholic stuff at all. Schools do it. I've attended them. And they do a good job of it without the religious trappings at all. It's decided that you really want to go with it. I know my colleague Richard McClellan spoke about the secularization, and he said, yeah, just secularize. So if that's what people wanted to do, they could. But remember, it won't be anymore, however good it is, distinctively Jesuit or Catholic, okay, regardless of what kind of slogans you choose to put on your t-shirt. So thank you for letting me spout off a little.
It is the practice at the Socratic Club to promote conversation by having a respondent, and I'm very pleased to have Dr. Ellen Macarone. She came to Gonzaga in 2005. She has degrees from George Washington University, Colorado State, and the University of Florida. Interesting, we didn't plan this, but again, state university background. And one thing that impressed me about Dr. Macarone, I have to say, when faculty come to Gonzaga, of course, when you start at an institution, there's a time where you're learning about the institution, and I think Dr. Macarone has kind of set a standard for educating herself about what Jesuit education is all about. She has Catholic education in her background. She may speak to that, but she really has taken an extra effort to find out what Gonzaga is all about and how Gonzaga lives out Jesuit education. So I'm sure she has some interesting and helpful things to say in response to Dr. Hutchins' talk. Welcome.
So I am going to talk some about my background and how I ended up here at Gonzaga, and as Dr. Calhoun mentioned, kind of what I did to kind of get up to speed with Jesuit education. And I will talk some about social justice, but I'm also going to talk about a few other key features and how that helped motivate me and put me in the position I am today as a real, I think, advocate and champion of Jesuit education. So a little bit different than Dr. Hutchins, my experience with Jesuit education began as a professor, not as a student. I had no acquaintance with Jesuit education, save for a few sporting events I attended at Boston College and high school. Go Eagles, right? I got to Gonzaga. I was teaching at a state university my first year out of graduate school in Minnesota, and was on the job market again. And I remember having two very profound conversations, one with the graduate placement advisor at the University of Florida and one with the department chair at the University of Florida. The conversation with the placement advisor went something like this. He said, the best school you're interviewing at is Michigan State. They have a PhD program. That's the job you want. And I said, no, I don't want to go to Michigan State. And he said, well, where do you want to go? And I said, I want to go to Gonzaga. And he said, I've never even heard of that school. And I said, I'm not really sure that that is a good reason for me not to teach there. And so we went back and forth, hung up the phone, called the department chair at Florida, and I'm like, Robert, this is what happened when I just talked with the placement advisor. And he said, he thinks that Michigan State is a better school because it has a PhD program than a Jesuit school. And I said, yes. And he says, you don't actually have to talk to him anymore. And I said, great. I said, because this is not helping me, right? I had learned an awful lot about what I needed as a professor that was different than what I needed as a student for my first year teaching at that mid-sized state university in Minnesota. And what I discovered was what I needed as a student was a lot of freedom to be able to do what I wanted to do and explore what I wanted to explore. And what I needed as a professor was a community. And that made, of the many places I was interviewing that year, Gonzaga my number one choice. And I remember sitting out in front of the dean's office with Dr. Steverson, and I said to him, you know, Gonzaga is my first choice, which you're not supposed to do during an interview. And Brian didn't laugh at me, so I thought maybe this was going to work out. And lo and behold, I've been here now for almost 8 years. But I did grow up in Boston, just outside, fully immersed in the Catholic intellectual tradition. Both of my parents, now retired, went to Catholic colleges. Dad went to Providence College in Providence, Rhode Island, which is Dominican. And Mom went to Merrimack College in North Andover, Massachusetts, which is Augustinian. She was a member of the fourth graduating class. And my sister was a member of the graduating class 20-something years later. So big Augustinian tradition in my family, which is saying quite a lot considering only 2 Augustinian colleges in America. And both of my parents first taught at Catholic high schools, and both taught in the sciences. So faith and reason joined together were a big part of my upbringing too. There was never any question that you could be a faithful scientist. We were encouraged by my parents to use our intellectual abilities to help us understand the world God made and our place in it. I have 2 siblings. And we were to use this understanding in some way to help others. My parents didn't do this only through teaching, but through political activism and volunteerism, both civic and church-related. My dad often says, you know, Catholic immigrant families come to America, first they're police and fire, then they get educated and have to figure out some other profession to help other people, teaching. Right? There's a little bit of truth to that idea. It's not an uncommon pattern to see in Catholic families. And while I'm not from Boston proper, I am your Boston half-breed, half-Irish, half-Italian, Catholic American. So while I didn't undertake my parents' scientific interests, they certainly understand my teaching, my activism, my volunteerism, and the quest to understand the world that I have, although I do it through philosophy, not through physics and chemistry. What I quickly discovered upon my arrival at Gonzaga was that the Jesuit charism was a very special sort of the Catholic intellectual tradition. What I knew was a little too general, not really specific enough. It was like saying you like Asian food because you like Chinese and being flummoxed when you get a Korean menu from a restaurant. Like you don't know what to do. The letters don't even look the same. You have to really point at the numbers this time around. But that's really what I found myself. I knew just enough to know. I had no idea what I was doing. So I undertook a few things that, as the motto of the Jesuit Volunteer Corps goes, ruined me for life. I find it difficult to imagine teaching in a different context now, and even if I were to do so, I'm pretty sure that I would take my Jesuit pedagogical principles outside of the Gonzaga community to wherever I was teaching. It's a method of teaching that has pretty good results, and that's pretty similar to some of the things that Dr. Hutchins has said. When done outside of a Jesuit school, it can have good results. But when done in a comprehensive Jesuit context, I think it can have remarkable results. And as our 125th slogan, tradition, transformation, or transformation, tradition, I don't know, tells us that this is really part of something that is at once changing, but always rooted in something that's familiar. There are three things that I did, and I continue to do, that really prepared me for a full embracing of Jesuit education. The first was to talk to people in the know, and that included asking really wildly ignorant questions, making the spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius, and to practice what I preach, which in this case means get reflective and intentional. So, talking to people in the know. I talked to my colleagues in the philosophy and religious studies departments. We used to have a book club, remember?
Yes.
Philosophy and religious studies. We got together a couple of times, read a book. And the philosophy department and religious studies department, when I joined, contained a few Jesuit scholastics, young Jesuits in training, and they were much closer in age to me than many of my colleagues, and so it was a comfortable fit to be friends with them, and they were very open, very welcoming, and were very willing to answer any of my nutty questions. And this showed me also that what I needed was some of what they were getting, which was a little formation. I just didn't have it. Admittedly, as a young Catholic woman and the first new woman teaching in the philosophy department in a couple of decades, I was a bit of a celebrity here on campus. There was a rumor that went around my first year that I was Mike Conley's niece. The truth of the matter is, his sister taught with my dad. Okay, that's weird. And his sister's name is Ellen. Okay, you can see how this rumor got started. But so every Jesuit on campus wanted to meet me. Right? So I had all these, very nice men, these very nice priests who wanted to get to know me. So it made it easier for me to really get in touch with and have people that I could ask questions to. People were very welcoming, both in and out of the Jesuits when I got here, and willing to share with me their expertise and their enthusiasm for this kind of education. I was also, brash, naive, I'm not sure, but I requested a meeting with our vice president for mission my first semester here at Gonzaga. Then Father Pat Lee, who's now the provincial of the Oregon province of the Society of Jesus, and Pat and I have become good friends and still keep in touch, even though he's down in Portland now, dealing with all kinds of headaches that I don't envy him at all. But the mentoring relationship that Pat and I were able to develop was really one based on trust and care for one another. And that was very important because I felt free to ask him questions, to vent my frustrations, to be unclear about things, about how I was going forward. And other Jesuits in particular, Father Maher and Father Moynihan, they didn't treat any question as one that I should be embarrassed to have asked. Mike Maher even let me sit in on his Jesuit history class one semester. I learned a ton from sitting in on that class, and I never did the reading. Just sat there. They took each inquiry, all of these Jesuits and my faculty colleagues, in the spirit in which it was made, of a genuine desire to learn, and with knowledge that such desires really are from God. They helped initiate me into their world, which has become in some small way, not as an alumna of a Jesuit school, but as a lay collaborator in the mission work of the Jesuit apostolate here at Gonzaga, my world too. In short, I made it my business to learn what I could about my new role as a Jesuit educator. I did it in a way that was pretty obvious to those in the know that this wasn't merely a professional strategy of mine, but it was a development of myself as a professional within this and further my own faith life. And that led me to make the spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius through a program that we have here in Spokane called SEAL, which means the Spiritual Exercises in Everyday Life, which is sponsored by the Apostolic Works of the Society of Jesus here in Spokane, which include the University, Gonzaga Prep, St. Al's Parish, the Jesuit House community, and as like a little side note to the Oregon province itself. While Jesuits make the retreat in 30 days of silence, most people don't have that luxury. I don't, I have bills to pay. And even Ignatius knew this, so he made provisions for doing it another way in the actual document. It's called the 19th Annotation. And here in Spokane, we do it over the 9-month academic year. By making the exercises, I learned about Jesuit spirituality, right, and totally transformed my faith life and my relationship with Christ. Since my spiritual director for the retreat, Sister Mary Garvin, God rest her soul, she passed away in January. She was also a professor and an expert on the spiritual exercises as they relate to women. I was in really good hands. Through direction with her, I was able to connect my faith life with my professional life in a much more deep and meaningful way than had ever happened before in my life. Participating in Jesuit spirituality significantly changed my understanding of Jesuit pedagogy as well, because I was able to see the aspects of teaching that Jesuit educators prize as having direct roots in the exercises and in spirituality that I had not seen before. For example, cure personalis is actually the commitment of a spiritual director towards her directee. The director has a responsibility to that directee to care for him in ways that contribute to the overall benefit of that person. This maps on nicely to the relationship between teachers and students, but its root is in the spiritual exercises. The root of pretty much everything we do, whether we recognize it or not in Jesuit University, should at least have its roots in the spiritual exercises and our understanding of that way of thinking about the Catholic faith. Or take a modern Jesuit idea, which has its roots in the spiritual exercises, men and women for and with others, which is the social justice aspect that Dr. Hutchins was talking about, right? In the exercises, we walk the passion with Jesus. We are for and with him in this journey. This is a model of being for and with others who struggle with marginalization and oppression. As a principle of Jesuit education, we are teaching solidarity. As an element of the exercises, we are learning how to be with Jesus as he is with us. As a last example of these kinds of principles from the exercises, finding God in all things, which I recently learned Ignatius only wrote once, and that more often he wrote seeking God in all things, which is actually, I think, way better. Once I had that connection, that seeking God in all things, the connection to the exercises was really clear to me. In seeking God in all things, we strive to find where God speaks to us, even in the messiness and unpleasantness that life often presents. We can find the love of God, says Ignatius, even in our desolations. When we can, we know it has been instructive. Sometimes, he says, our consolations are false and not from God. We are easily deceived by evil, and think that all that is good or experiences that are pleasant are from God, but that is often a mistake. Ignatius asks us to guard against this. And in seeking God in all things, we seek to understand the messiness and unpleasantness of life, just as we seek to understand what is great and beautiful. I fall back on the spiritual practice of the exercises often, and I recommend it highly to people who want to deepen their faith and understanding of the Jesuit charism. Practice what you preach, intentionality and reflection. Intentionality and reflection are key elements of Jesuit education and ones I want my students to develop while at GU. And I turn these to my teaching all the time. What I discovered initially was that my teaching in many respects already aligned with the principles of Jesuit pedagogy, likely due to my roots with the Catholic intellectual tradition and being a philosopher more generally. But there's always room for improvement. One way I did this was to be more transparent with my students. This required me to get over what secular education had modeled to me over and over again. That is, no talking about religion. I do it often now, right? I use analogies. Celeste will say that. Don't I use weird Catholic analogies in class sometimes? Yeah. Okay. But they work, right? Yeah, they work. Okay. I do find that students are receptive and desiring of this of their faculty. When I plan a new course or revise the syllabus, I have content and educational goals, as well as standards about how what I do fits into a Jesuit model of education and what we desire for our students. Right? And what we desire for our students has to be for the greater glory of God. That's what unites all of this together. So to come full circle, what I have found is that while I came to Jesuit education as a professor, I became a student of things I thought I already knew, my faith and good teaching. The Jesuits have taught me more about both of these than I came here with, more about them than I say about it, that some respond to as a brand, but its roots and meaning both for its students and those who transmit it to them can have a much greater significance. And in that greatness, a realization that we have much to be humble about, as we are just a tiny note in a long tradition that is about much more than us alone. Our responsibility to carry this out to the wider world takes effort, work, faith, knowledge, and understanding if we are to do it successfully. And it's work that is always incomplete, but continues here today. Thank you.
Well, did you want to make any comment, or shall we go to discussion? What would you like to do? Okay.
What other people?
Questions? Reflections?
I have a question about the relationship between sort of Jesuit understanding and social justice. There seems that a lot of discussion of marginalization deals with the understanding of person as a multiplicity of overlapping identities, such that I'm black, I have a sexual orientation, I've got a socioeconomic orientation, I am not a single central self, but a collection of these other sort of fragmented subjects. Is that the understanding of social justice in this tradition, or am I mistaken? If not, what is the understanding of social justice inside the Jesuit tradition?
Well, I think the understanding of social justice within the Jesuit tradition often gets conflated with the idea that volunteerism is social justice. And I think that that's a mistake, and I actually think it's a great departure from what we're really supposed to be doing. Volunteering is great, and it's often work that's really better characterized as charity, which clearly has an important role in a Catholic Jesuit institution. But social justice is supposed to get at the social structures that cause that fragmented understanding of oneself, right? I mean, if you, help out in a soup kitchen, that's fabulous because someone gets fed, but it does nothing about the social condition that caused them to need the food, right? To think of themselves as a homeless person or a poverty-stricken person instead of a whole person. Right? If we think about social justice as attacking or adjusting the social structures, that's really, I think, a much more beneficial way of thinking about it within really not only the Jesuit context, but more broadly too. So I think you're right that we often think about marginalization and oppression in terms of those identified markers about some part of ourselves. And that the kind of interesting thing that Jesuit education brings to a discussion of social justice is to say, we attack those social structures so each person can be whole. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I mean, so it's a question of, is social justice more concerned with ensuring people's material needs are met, or is it more concerned with creating a philosophical space within which I can become a whole person while meeting those material needs?
Well, social justice is definitely concerned with people's material needs, but you can have injustice that's independent of material needs, right? You can have injustice that's due to some other kinds of social structure that may result in, claiming an identity that's not as particularly helpful as some other identity might be. So certainly the wholeness has some material resources that are likely to be needed, but we really are talking about adjusting the social structures so that those needs and other maybe psychological or emotional needs can be met, right? We can do that in a real kind of political oriented way, or we can do it in a more holistic way, and Jesuit education would probably default to a more holistic way of doing it, and might even privilege some of the psychological and emotional needs in a way that a more political orientation wouldn't bother with. Right? Once people's material needs are met, social justice is done, we're finished, and that might be what the political rather than the Jesuit way of looking at justice would result in. Does that help?
Yep. Thank you.
I'm wondering if you could talk to me a little bit about how your philosophy of advising, which is, I think, another important relationship you have with students here, has been influenced by your Jesuit experience.
We philosophy advising.
Yeah, I
And
imagine.
both the sort of formal advisees that we're going over course schedules and midterm grades with and requirements for graduation, and then through maybe student clubs or organizations where we advise students in a different sort of way. I think it does play out. There's the very pragmatic of I catch myself, you know, you can have the conversation with a student, well, no, you have to take X, Y, and Z because that's a requirement for your degree and you will not graduate in time if you don't, which is a conversation you have to have sometimes, right? But I don't know if it's the philosophical background. You know, I don't want people just to agree to do it. I want them to agree that the ideas are right? And so I think we do find a sort of different role from what my advising was in college of trying to let students into the circle, so to speak, about what it is we're trying to accomplish.
Yeah, I think that, you know, with advising, and Christina, you may have heard me say this kind of thing before, there seem to be a couple of different ways of doing it, and I think Debbie hinted at it when, you know, she said sometimes cura personalis is interpreted as this warm fuzzy, and you know, unfortunately, that's not what cura personalis often demands, especially when it comes to advising. I find myself having conversations like, I don't care what your mother wants you to take, that's irrelevant. We've got a core curriculum, you need to take these things, and your mom is not an expert on how to meet the educational goals that we have for you and that you need to have for yourself. I once had to tell a student that her mom was not allowed to call in on her cell phone during a meeting about the schedule, which was a shock to both of them, but so not happening. But on the flip side, you know, I mean, that's my snarky advising moment about your personality. But on the flip side, I often have conversations with students like, this is your chance to explore something, you know, deeply that you care about. You're going to get the skills you need from this kind of broad-based liberal arts education. You're going to get them in ways that are meaningful to you, no matter what you end up doing as a job. What do you think most history majors do? They work in business, so you don't need to major in business necessarily. You can major in whatever it is that you find fascinating and hone those skills there. And that's cura personalis in a really different way, encouraging a student's natural interests and actually combating, you know, the kind of secular, you need to have a business major to get a degree so that you can get a job, which is just, you know, inaccurate in so many ways. So I think that there are some tools and tricks about the relationship that you build with your advisees, or you can build, that are rooted in these same elements of Jesuit pedagogy and Jesuit spirituality that encourage those kinds of deeper conversations about what students want to learn.
I've got some advice about advising once that I'd like to share from a Jesuit. Jesuit, I actually have referred to a couple of times today, who was a professor of mine. He served on my dissertation committee. He was my spiritual advisor for my good friend, and he's quite a character. He was a speaker here a couple of years ago, and I was seeking his advice about dealing with a student. I'm very former student. I remain very close to 8 years after the fact. We speak weekly. And I was saying, well, I don't know. He said, yeah, you're handling them all wrong. He said, Deb, what it should always feel like to you. I can't tell you exactly how to do it. He said, well, and he said it with a smile, but I later realized that's what he thinks when he's dealing with me. He said, it should always feel like you're simultaneously, you know, stroking hair and kicking ass. So,
I want to build on that, because I think often in practical implementation, cura personalis is invoked as an attitude of indulgence towards
Yes.
students. You didn't quite use that word, but that's what you're getting at, and Ellen, you kind of referred to that just a moment ago. Why should a genuine, robust Jesuit conception of cura personalis not be, I mean, what's wrong with that indulgent conception of cura personalis? In other words, well, it's kind of related to your example about, the students want to see the basketball game, so they have to go early and get their tickets, they're going to miss class. Isn't that what you should allow? I mean, that's a kind of indulgent view
I
of what
think I
cura
should
personalis is.
understand their desire to do so if I want to enter into the life of a student. And I do understand their desire to do so, but no, I don't think so. And I don't think that Ellen's going to think so either. I strongly suspect, since we dropped across the hall. I do think that it's seen that way and used that way sometimes. But if I was going to answer why, it's a funny thing is we age or go through life. I don't know if you have those aha moments when you all of a sudden see things differently. I do a lot, and I'm slow about them too. They occur to me years after maybe they should. I remember, like many of the things that we have to in my opinion, live up to cura personalis, disappoint or make people unhappy with. And in many ways, just to be a person of conscience, you're going to sometimes make people unhappy with things you do or say. At one point in my life, I remember thinking all the sort of restrictions of religion, there are a bunch of rules to keep you doing what you might want to do is just one rule after another. And then I remember, I hope it was maturing to a certain point, well, you do that because, and follow them because they make you a morally good person. At some point, though, fairly recently in my life, I had an aha moment that I think speaks to this, is that you do them, all the rules that we've set down, all the ideas, the sterner side of what we think cura personalis really means, giving you what you need, not what you want, is in place and exists, much like the rules set down by our religious tradition. Our tradition is, they're the rules because all along it's not a restriction on us. That's what's best for us. That's what allows the full flourishing of the human person. And that's what we're supposed to be directed at, and that's not always what we want. We want, we're willful. We want what our wills and our whims and our passing notions are, and to go to basketball games and to do all sorts of things. But that doesn't mean that it's good for us, and that doesn't mean that it forms us into the type of person that God intends us to be. Not even just to serve God, but for our own sake, for the health of what a human person is supposed to be. I don't know if that's a good answer, but it's the answer that occurs to me.
Well, it's not unlike the answer that I would give either. It's just that I think, in some sense, human beings are really bad long-range planners.
Yeah.
And I'm sure
We're
that there's,
distracted.
I often think that there may be a evolutionary reason for this, that, thinking more than a couple of generations out is probably, not so good from that perspective. But, we're even bad long-range planners when it comes to, like, today, right? And we have competing desires, and students want to do well and succeed and be happy and flourish, and they also want to have fun with their friends and the activities they participate in that give them good memories and those kinds of things. But sometimes because we're still learning, we have to have someone else say, no, this isn't the place to balance those things that way. I once had an advisee, going back to Christina's question, where I finally said to her, I'm not signing any more withdrawal slips for math. And she's like, what? And I said, I'm just not going to sign another withdrawal slip for math. I said, you're going to make it through the whole semester math, even if you get an F. You got to pass math. And she's like, I really don't want to take math. And I'm like, but you want to graduate, so you actually have to want to take math. Right? I mean, those things go together. You can't have one without the other. Right? And this was tough love, and she was shocked right? The end of the semester came where I made her, stick out the math class, like, what's that low level, explorations or
Yeah,
invitations? I can't remember what the name of that.
Excursions.
Excursions.
Yeah.
Let's take a trip in math, right?
Right.
Sure.
And she came, the day that, she took her final exam, she came in, she's like, Dr. Macron, I am pretty sure I am passing math. She got a D. She was never so proud of a D in her whole life, right? And I'm like, and now you're done with math, right? She would have dropped it if I had signed that withdrawal slip. I know she would have, because she kind of almost cried when I told her I wasn't going to do it again. It was the 5th time she had asked me to sign a withdrawal slip for math, right? What was good for her was to actually make it all the way through. And it wasn't until she had someone else tell her, this is what's good for you, she actually had the confidence to do it. Right? This indulgence, you get to do whatever you want, really is bad for people, and it means that we very rarely live up to our own potential, right? And if we're trying to get at the magis and other kinds of things that are related to what we say we do here at a Jesuit institution, sometimes you do need a little tough love. And this is one of those times. You'll still have plenty of good memories of being at Gonzaga. Nostalgia and shared experience is one of the best things we do here.
I don't know if he's a Jesuit, but Henry Nouwen I know is a Catholic priest. And there's a good book by him that's called Making All Things New. And one of the things he talks about in there is that people in our contemporary society are filled but unfulfilled. And so, when you walk around the halls here, you can ask somebody, hey, how are you doing? And say, good, busy, how it goes. It's either the beginning of the semester, midterms, or finals. And so, how we're doing is built around the task or what you're doing, rather. And, it gets to the point where busy becomes a status symbol. So if you're not busy, if you're not doing something, there's something wrong with you. And I think that, I'll graduate in May this year, and sometimes I ask myself, what have I done, or what am I working for? And this idea of pure personalis and as a central part of the Jesuit education, where's the central point? Because it's not a bad thing to have things to do. But I think the key point is finding a way to unite them all together so that it's for something, not isolated individual tasks that are just to accomplish them in the first place. And there's another good book. It's The Rise of Universities by Charles Homer Haskins, which actually Dr. Takach recommended to me to read just about universities. And there's, I think, a quote in here that applies directly to the conversation we're having today. And he says, such a university, he's talking about the first ones, such a university had no board of trustees and published no catalog. It had no student societies, except so far as the university itself was fundamentally a society of students. No college journalism, no dramatics, no athletics, none of those outside activities, which are the chief excuse for inside inactivity in American college. And that's, a basketball game isn't bad. Drama's not bad. Catalogs aren't bad. But there is something to be said about having too much to do. And I'll finish this now because I've been getting up to this point. So, what do you put in place of that? What do you put? How do you cure this, for lack of a better word, disease of busyness? And there's no, you can't industrialize it, you can't have a formula for it, but I'd say it's relationships. There's a few students in here, and maybe I'll just take some selfish liberties and speak for all the students right now, but we look up to professors. Even though we may not talk to you all the time, or call you on the weekend, we think
That's
about
okay.
about you, because there's 4 years here where we are questioning a lot of things. And so that's left open to a lot of impression. And I think if there were more relationships with professors, like student to professor relationships, student to student, professor to administrator, and so on and so forth, I think this idea of answering the question, what is a person, would be asked more frequently. Though it may not be answered, at least it would be probed. And the fact that it would be probed would probably prevent things like the excessive amount of rapes and things that, we're always getting emails about. And so I just think it's an interesting point that you had both mentioned. I like the stance you took. It's just interesting to wonder why maybe it's not as important to everybody as you two find it to be.
Well, I think, when I talked about reflection and being intentional, I think that that's some of what can cure some of the busyness, right? If you give yourself space to be be reflective and intentional. Brett Hendricks, who works for the College of Arts and Sciences, some of you may know, he runs all of our computer labs. He calls it the cult of busyness, right? Which I think is perfect. He hates it when you ask how someone is and they say busy. And I know because I've said that to him, and he's like, oh, you have to stop that. And we had actually a meaningful conversation about why he thought I should stop that. And I'm just like, you're right. You're absolutely right. People take it as being a status symbol, and that is a problem. I do think that we do a slightly better job building relationships here at Gonzaga than other places I've been. There is more of an exchange across departments, even though we are highly siloed. There are more meaningful conversations and opportunities to have them with students than at other places I've been that have been big state institutions. The school I taught at before Gonzaga, I had classes of 252 because there were 252 seats in the auditorium. I don't know the names of any of those students, and I didn't even while I had them. But here I do. But I do think we have to be, interestingly, intentional about being reflective and intentional. We have to make it a priority to take that time and space to think about what we're doing and is it worthwhile? Does it give meaning to our lives? Or is it just more stuff to do? And that's a very difficult cultural shift to make. But your point is well taken, that this is a real problem for not only our institution, but I think our wider culture, that we don't spend very much time making meaning, and we don't spend very much time just being quiet with ourselves to decide whether or not we're even doing anything that might be making meaning.
I'd like to thank you for bringing that up. I think that's so true, and it's not students, it's not you, it's not the author of the book, because I see myself in that. I think it's a constant problem. I've had lots of days where I'm going all day, and I get to the end of the day, and I can't tell you what it was all for, why it was so important. I've signed papers all day long. I've chased after errands, and all the things we do that fill our time. Maybe that's one way that we should consider ourselves for the health of the human person. Another way in which we really should heed a call to be countercultural in that respect. I think you hit the nail on the head. It is the cult of busyness.
That's correct.
Yeah.
I'm not taking credit for the good phrases that
yes.
are.
I'm an engineer, so I don't go to basketball games. My daughter may not, aren't you? I'm not in the business of it. I'm sorry, I have too many classes at the time. But that kind of busy goes through the book. When I was talking to people who have been here and who've been to other schools, the one thing one person who did work said was, you'll understand what I mean after we it's a mindset. I'm a professor at Jesuit. I have friends at other major universities. They don't have to do grab bag, no philosophy. There's their person right there. And it's a grab bag. And you miss out so much. Being non-traditional military, it's seen a lot of different things. I've worked with a lot of engineers. And one thing so many of them are woefully lacking besides personality is the ability to think, well, what does that other person think? I've got this brilliant design. Maybe I want it. It doesn't work for them. We're not rational, purely logical beings. And there is that spiritism. They just think because I'm logical, rational, I can't have anything else. And they block out much of their creativity because they're so focused on the small structural problem. And you can't see outside the box. Even though the problem they're working on is very important, but they don't understand being a user. That's one of the things I understand what my friend said. It's one of the reasons for confidence.
That's a great catchphrase to reapply to the idea of career personalis again. So we have to know and understand the end user.
Let's thank our speakers.